And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
So good afternoon and welcome to the University of Virginia Center for Politics Global Perspectives on Democracy Program's Ambassador Series. My name is Damon Irby and I'm Director of Global Initiatives at the Center for Politics. Today we welcome His Excellency Juan Gabriel Valdez, Ambassador of Chile to the United States, who is joined by UVA's resident Chile expert, Professor Thomas Klubach of the Department of History. Following the dialogue between Ambassador Valdez and Professor Klubach, we will have ample time for questions and answers. So as we mosey along in our event, please be thinking of what you might ask, especially students. Note it down because we want to make sure we get as many questions answered as we can. Chile and the University of Virginia have maintained quite a number of relationships over the years. There have been study abroad programs. Our Department of Astronomy has worked with Chilean experts to install a special telescope in the Atacama region to open up the southern skies to our scientists. And here at the Center for Politics, we have hosted a series of youth exchanges called the Youth Ambassadors Program that have included, to this point, over 100 Chilean youth. And in fact, we have another group coming to us in March, which we're very excited about. So we have a nice long history with Chile. Not only do we have this experience right now, but of course we have to bring up Thomas Jefferson, right? He had a particular interest in Chile, and this came to our knowledge through letters that were written between the South American freedom fighter Francisco de Miranda, who was quite well known in that region, was kind of an Indiana Jones figure of his time. He was quite unique. So he and Thomas Jefferson were friends. And in 1806, gifted Jefferson a copy of La Historia Natural y Civile del Chile, the natural and civil history of Chile, and mentioned in his letter that it was much more thorough than other books Jefferson read on Chile. Jefferson said this, which means Jefferson clearly had a unique interest in Chile, and not only had read one book, but multiple books. So this one was apparently especially good. So I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities for our university and Chile to work together in the future. But most recently, on a more national level, our United States government showed the importance of Chile as Secretary Blinken paid a visit to the country and met with President Gabriel Boric. And I know Mr. Ambassador here had a significant role in that trip. When there, they spoke about our common interests as nations and about opportunities for the future. So thank you for your role in preparation for that, Mr. Ambassador. So you will not find a more experienced diplomat than Ambassador Valdez, and he has unmatched service to Chile. We could easily spend our day simply talking about all the things that he has done, but I will hit the highlights. So he served as a Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1999 through 2000, Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN from 2000 to 2004, Chief of the UN Mission to Haiti in 2004 through 2006. He organized a foundation, Fundación Imagen de Chile, which is dedicated to promoting Chile around the world. Served as professor at the Sorbonne in France. Was first appointed and served as the ambassador to the United States in 2014 through 2018. He was a visiting professor at Columbia University in New York, and director of the Institutional and Strategic Affairs at the University of Chile in Santiago. So this past spring, we were blessed by his president nominating him to serve as our ambassador once again. And we're most grateful for that because, again, you cannot find a more accomplished ambassador than Ambassador Valdez. So thanks to him. Thanks for you. So we're joined today by UVA's preeminent Chile scholar. Yes, it's true. Professor Thomas Klubach of the Department of History, who is the author of countless books, chapters, and articles related to the country and the region. His most recent book, Ronquil, Rural Rebellion, Political Violence, and Historical Memory in Chile, was published just this past year by the Yale University Press. Klubach served as the co-director of UVA's Americas Center and director of the Latin American Studies program. So I could go on about his credentials too, but it's probably about time to move on to the more interesting part of the program from our ambassador and our wonderful professor. So, Mr. Ambassador, I open the floor to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you both.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me at this wonderful, important, beautiful university. Particularly, I want to thank Professor Irby and Professor Klubach for their invitation today. And to be in this magnificent room is really moving to me, and it's extremely important for Chile. I want to say just 2 words before the conversation. This year, Chile and the United States are commemorating 200 years of their diplomatic relations. In 1823, the US Congress decided to recognize the independence of Chile and sent an ambassador, who was a congressman from Vermont. Unfortunately, Chile took 4 years to send an ambassador here. And when they sent one, Mr. Campino, he came to Washington, and he was not paid in dollars but in pesos, and he didn't know what to do with them. Therefore, he moved to Baltimore in order to wait for the ships that were bringing his salary. Therefore, the history is always simple and complicated at the same time. The point is that relations began with 2 things and 2 concepts that I want to underline. The first thing is that even before the Chilean ambassador arrived in Washington or the American ambassador arrived to Chile, Americans were extremely important in the creation of the Republic of Chile, in the formation of the first constitution. Joel Robert Poinsett was a man who was also some sort of adventurer, a remarkable man who traveled through Russia, through Europe at the time, and finished in Chile, being a friend of José Miguel Carrera, who was the first hero of our independence. And they made friends, and he convinced Carrera of the need to have a republic with freedom of the press, with a democracy, with a constitution. It is not by chance that the first Congress of Chile was inaugurated on the 4th of July of 1812. And it is not by chance that when the Chilean leaders of the independence proclaimed the independence of the country, they said that one of the examples they had for them was George Washington. Therefore, the importance and the influence of the United States on Chile since the formation of the Republic is undeniable. At the same time, there is a second characteristic: the permanent will of Chile to be an autonomous republic and to have autonomy. And this meant that even if we were good friends with the United States, we disagreed in certain areas with the United States. In 1834, the United States proposed the first trade agreement to Chile, and they signed a trade agreement that was written in part by Andrés Bello, the famous Venezuelan who went to Chile and was the first rector of the University of Chile, and it proclaims the permanent and definite peace and friendship between Chile and the United States, between Chileans and Americans, between all those who occupy the territories of the two countries. But at the same time, it says that it won't give the United States the preferential preferential treatment, because it has to attend as preferential treatment to the other republics of Latin America that are our real brothers. Then it was friendship, but it was also with a certain independence. I'm saying this because a commemoration is many things. Is a way of recuperating memory, reorganizing collective memory, but at the same time it is a celebration. And I have been following these two dimensions, because of course we have had many disagreements with the United States during the 19th century and the 20th century. And this year will also be the anniversary of the 50 years since the military coup of 1973, and of the intervention, therefore, of the United States in Chile that took from 1960 to 1973, 74. We think that is history. History cannot be corrected. It happened. The fact is that even if it happened, today, after we recuperated democracy, the friendship between the United States and Chile has been rebuilt in a way which is much stronger than it was before. President Bush's father visited Chile when Aylwin was elected, the first president after the end of the dictatorship. And since then, presidents of Chile have come here, presidents of the United States have been there, Clinton was there, Obama was there. I'm trying to bring Biden to Chile this year. It's not an easy thing, but we signed the treaty, we signed the free trade agreement. Chile, Colombia, and Mexico are the only ones who have the free trade agreement with Chile. We trust each other. We disagree sometimes, but we are good friends. And this is extremely important to Chile, because Chile does not depend. Chile chooses to be an excellent friend of the United States. And this is extremely valuable in these times. Therefore, this year what we want to do is to celebrate people who have changed their lives, Americans who have changed their lives knowing Chile or living in Chile, or Chileans who have seen their lives changed because they have lived in the United States. And I was thinking, when Professor was presenting this talk about astronomy, because in fact in 1845, the United States sent the first astronomical expedition in the Western Hemisphere to Chile, because the person who was in charge, Captain Shelley, I think, decided that the best place to look at the stars in the Western Hemisphere was Chile. And he installed a telescope in the Cerro Santa Lucia, in the middle of Santiago. And he did one thing which is extraordinary. All his research, all the papers he got during 2 years' work, he gave them to the University of Chile, and founded the National Astronomical Observatory. Chile is now a country full of telescopes. The northern part of Chile has one of the most extraordinary laboratories in the world to look at the stars. Americans, Japanese, Europeans participate in this effort, and they are building now they are building together with Chileans the most important telescope for the 21st century, the new generation of telescopes. This began in 1848 with an American. And I think that you can find also examples of Chileans, I don't want to talk more, but examples of Chileans who came here and made an impact. we have wondered enormously with the president and with other authorities of the Chilean government how to celebrate the 200 years the same year that we have to commemorate the 50 years of the coup. And it is not an easy thing. But I recommended one thing, that we celebrate the American movement in favor of human rights. The movement of human rights in this country began, in many senses, after the military coup in Chile. Institutions were formed, people were mobilized, and the solidarity with Chile movement was extraordinary, not only in this part of the country, but in the other part, in the other coast. Therefore, we are working with people who was alive at that time, trying to organize not a commemoration of the bad things, but a commemoration of how Americans managed to take one concept, human rights, that at one point was considered a silly thing, as somebody very famous said, to what is now a part of foreign policy of the United States, and something that brings us together with Chile, because we consider that human rights, equality between women and men, and democracy are the most essential things that characterize the Chilean Republic. Therefore, at your disposal, Professor, thank you very much for your work and your reception. Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you very much for being here. It's an honor. I think I want to pick up on the last comments you made about the U.S. relationship with Chile, and particularly ask you about how you see and how Chile sees the U.S. role in the region now, given that there have been fundamental changes in the last 2 decades, defined by, say, the rise of China as the most important trading partner for many Latin American nations, investor in development works and development more generally, and the kind of incremental recession of the United States, or withdrawal of the United States in some ways from Latin American affairs, a kind of almost disinterest, some might characterize as at.
It's not an easy question, because, of course, I have to be within my diplomatic boundaries. But let me say that it is clear that the United States is not in Latin America today the actor it was 20 years ago. That's evident. You couldn't imagine 20 years ago something like what is happening in Nicaragua, in which you have a dictator that puts in prison practically his whole political party, all his opponents, and the bishops of the Catholic Church, and nothing happens. At the same time, I think that the United States government, this government in particular, is very much aware of that situation, and they want to correct it. President Boric and President Biden met, which was an extraordinary meeting, given the fact that one is 36 years old and the other one is almost 80. Then the conversation began with President Biden saying, "How were you authorized to come into this room?" Because he couldn't believe it. And then he said about himself coming into the Senate, "When I went into the Senate, I was 28 and I was stopped by the police saying, where do you think you're going?" Then after this conversation, President Boric said to President Biden, "If you don't act soon, you will lose an enormous opportunity in Latin America." And President Biden said, "I have had to repair the situation with our friends in Europe, with the NATO. I have had to rebuild many relations in the world that have been damaged. I'm so sorry I haven't had the time to go to Latin America. I will travel this time. I will dedicate this year beginning now, and the next one, to work much more closely with Latin America." But as you know, there are 2 areas in this. First is the impulse to democracy, towards human rights, and towards certain principles which are very important to the United States. I think in that sense, Chile is seen by Washington as a real partner in which we can work together in situations like the condemnation to the dictatorship in Nicaragua, or the situation in Venezuela, or the situation in Cuba, or the situation in Haiti. And we have been working together. We have been working together very clearly. But it is essential to us, a US that promotes investments in Latin America and that is more active than what China is. China is not just our main partner in trade. China invests in people. And this is something that sometimes is not taken seriously here. If I ask you, which is the main actor in the relationship of Chilean municipalities, with whom municipalities relate the most in Chile, internationally, it's China. It's not Argentina. I was sure that it was Argentina when I was given the study. It's China. China has been much more attentive to the provinces of Chile than Santiago has been attentive to them. They visit permanently. They invite permanently the mayors, the alcaldes. This is becoming something, it was extraordinary before the pandemic. Of course, after the pandemic, the situation changed with China. But China is investing enormously on soft power. They are giving scholarships to young people, particularly from poorer neighborhoods, to study in China, etc. More important than that, China has a very clear way of looking at strategic minerals and strategic situations. Last week, there was the information that they were building a seaport in Argentina, in Tierra del Fuego. Why do you need a seaport in Tierra del Fuego? I mean, it is not a place where you have a lot of trade. It's obviously a strategic decision. And it is done by a private company, Chinese company, which is, of course, not a private company, but it is a company that's supported by the state. The same in our country. They have invested in lithium and they want to continue to invest in lithium and in rare earth and in green hydrogen. They are much eager to participate than American companies, and this has to be corrected. I don't want to take too long on this, and I will stop here, but I will say that the Inflation Reduction Act is something that concerns us because it creates a whole world of economic movement inside the US, but that has no linkages with countries that are associated with the US and need and have the resources the US need in order to transform energy in this country. We have to discuss that much more. We want to understand much more what the almost $400 billion invested in transforming energy in the US will be able to support more investments in Latin America or in countries which have a trade agreement with the US, like Chile and Colombia. We don't know yet, but this is an area which has to be discussed because it has economic, it has political, and it has geopolitical consequences.
Thank you. Relatedly, you mentioned mining and natural resources and scarce resources. I know that Chile, along with Bolivia and Argentina, holds the world's largest deposits of lithium. And lithium is seen as central to creating new global green economies in the United States, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Chile's role and what Chile's role in this new kind of green global economy might be, and also something about the environmental consequences of lithium mining inside the country, since the lithium mining has provoked so many environmental and social conflicts internally within Chile itself. And how this too relates to the issue of a Pacific partnership, what Obama and the Obama administration thought of as a Trans-Pacific partnership that was jettisoned very quickly, we know, but also kind of Chile's integration into the global economy and the global green economy.
Yes, thank you. The present Chilean government is a government that is committed not just to human rights, but also to preserving the environment and fighting global warming. Global warming has a particular effect in Chile given our geographical situation, and therefore we are suffering from a lack of water, and we are facing a future which is difficult. We are changing our energy grid not simply because of ideology. We are changing our energy grid because we don't produce any fossil fuel, any fossil energy source. And at the same time, we believe that the condition of the country forces us to make a complete transformation. In this context, the question of water is essential, and the question of keeping our environment safe is essential. We will probably talk about this later, but this was in the old, we call the old constitution, not the new constitution. I mean, that was written and rejected last year. But the element of the environment was essential to that constitution, and it will be essential in the new constitution. And I will explain, I will tell something more about that later. Therefore, when we talk about the Salar de Atacama, which is the place where lithium, which is the place most attractive to the world in Chile as a lithium deposit, we are talking about how can we treat that mineral using water and without damaging in a serious way the environment. This is a big question. At the same time, there is a political question. Copper is in the hands of the state in Chile. The big copper company is in the hands of the state, Codelco. It was nationalized during Allende, and it remains national. Lithium should also be nationalized. This is the normal reaction in Chile. If you ask people in the street, they will tell you, no, this is a strategic mineral, we should own it. But we need for investment for that. How do you manage to do that in a situation in which you have to send a law to Congress, which could take 5 years in debating the law before establishing a company that will begin doing dealings with lithium? This is a discussion that is taking place today. Now, my perception is that we will find a solution. There is a solution. The solution is to allow Codelco to establish a branch to exploit lithium. Once you've said that, you have to begin worrying about the environmental consequences of that. But I think that probably during this year, there will be a decision of the Chilean government in the way in which they will organize the selling or the investments in lithium, and they will make proposals to foreign companies. I've been working with people who, for instance, there is an American company that is already involved in exploiting lithium in Chile, Albemarle, with whom I have had discussions. They want to invest more, of course. But the environmental question will have to be solved. This is a very contentious story. 2 days ago or 3 days ago, a mining investment called Dominga was rejected by the government because it affected part of the coast of Chile, which was a reserve, which constituted a reserve of certain birds and particularly of ballenas, whales. Then this produced an enormous debate in the country, saying this country is not in a condition to reject an investment of millions of dollars, and at the same time the government said it is our task and it is our obligation to preserve environment. Therefore the debate will continue, and in the case of lithium it's more complicated because of the water. But I understand that there are solutions to it, and that some American companies are participating in the study of the exploitation of lithium without creating a mess in terms of the environment. This is what I know, I can tell you.
Thank you. You mentioned the Constitution and the failure of the new Constitution to pass in the last plebiscite in September. And I'm sure you're asked, like I am frequently, what happened? Why did I know a lot of people out here probably would like some kind of explanation of why a constitution failed pretty decisively at the ballot box after Chileans had gone in 3 successive elections and voted very favorably in favor of a new constitution, a progressive president, and a very progressive and independent constitutional convention. Yet then September comes and yes, the Constitution is dealt a death blow. So my first question, and I think probably most people here would love an answer, is what happened? And then second, what are the prospects going forward in terms of the Boric government's efforts to negotiate some kind of new constitutional referendum or new constitutional code for Chile?
I said at the time that we have become a country that is an expert on earthquakes and constitutions. But the point is that in order to explain what happened, I have to take a step forward, a step back, and talk about the famous insurrection, estallido social. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody imagined that 1.5 million Chileans would go into the streets in order to protest against practically everything. They felt humiliated, they felt they had been margined, they felt they were living in a city that was segregated, they felt that education was failing, they felt that health services were failing, and they felt overall that the idea of dignity had disappeared, swallowed by a wish to compete and to have a better economy or economic gains. It was a confusing mobilization because people could interpret whatever they wanted. In fact, when women went to the street, 1 million women, it was clear. That was the only thing that was extremely clear. Women wanted rights and wanted to participate in politics in a different way. As a result of this, political parties simply disappeared from the scene. Former leaders were attacked and criticized in a very excessive way, I would say excessive. And only the agreement between a broad spectrum going from the right to the left institutionalized the movement and agreed that a new constitution had to be written, and therefore the forces in the streets decided to follow the idea of the new constitution. But given the fact that the political forces were extremely weak, the decision was to elect people who were not political. And the first thing that happened was that movements organized around certain topics or certain causes were powerful in the competition, in the electoral competition. You had people who wanted to defend the environment, and therefore they organized themselves and they elected an important number of people in the convention. You had people who were in favor of women's rights, in favor of sexual minority rights, in favor of animal rights, in favor of many different things that got together in the convention, but frankly, they didn't have a vision of a constitution for the country. And they negotiated among themselves different texts, which came to be extremely progressive if you added them, but there was no vision in general of how a constitution functions. This is one problem. The second problem is that the Constitutional Convention was weakened since the beginning by the behavior of some of the members of Congress, of the convention. And this was profited by the conservative sectors and by the conservative press. The fact that one of the members of the convention was elected because he said he had cancer and he had no way of paying for his treatment, to be discovered 3 months later that he had never had cancer and he had never applied to any sort of medical subvention, was of course a discredit to the whole of the convention. The fact that members of the right and extreme right that were elected as a minority in the convention used television to say words, obscenities against other members of the convention, gave the impression to the public that this was a circus. In fact, in many senses, the text was rejected not because people thought that the text was bad, but because they didn't like the people who wrote the text. This is one factor. The second factor is that the Constitution, even if it was extremely progressive, and it was seen by many people in the world as an example of the way in which the Constitution ought to be written, had a problem. It guaranteed 50% of participation for women. It guaranteed 18% of participation for indigenous people. But let me tell you one thing. Chile is not a multinational society, a plurinational society. It's not. Chile is a society in which indigenous populations have been harassed, abused, persecuted, robbed of their properties and their lands. But you cannot say, after saying that as a result of that, you ought to proclaim Chile as a plurinational society, because it's not. Then what happened was that a country which anybody who reads its history realizes the level of unity and the level of concentration of the national identity, which is very old. The national identity of Chile was formed, according to historians and young historians that have written on that, around the 1830s, when Chile confronted the Confederación Perú-Boliviana, the 30s of the 19th centuries. This produced a reaction of people. The idea that there was a justice for the indigenous people and another justice for the Chileans was not clear. Then all these sort of stories were very easy to exploit, and people reacted very much against the Constitution. Now, what happened later? What happened later was that there was a very important, I would say, reaction of the society in terms of saying, we have rejected this Constitution, but we want a new Constitution. We don't want to continue with the old Constitution written at the beginning during the regime of Pinochet. And at the same time, there were things that you couldn't go back from. 50% for women, recognition of the indigenous people, not 18% of recognition, but 9% of recognition among the elected. The protection of the environment in the Constitution. I mean, Chile is not the same it was before the previous Constitution. Therefore, what was agreed was a framework designed by Congress, and in an agreement that covers from the Communist Party to the Republican Party, which is an extreme right party that has just been formed in Chile, there was an agreement to frame what had to be written in the Constitution and to establish a type of agenda that would include the election by the Congress of experts that would support the members of the elected constitution, elected constitutionalists. Therefore, the experts will be appointed by the Congress this week. In May, we are going to elect 50 members of a constitutional assembly, and these members, with the experts, will have a text prepared by December in which we will vote for the new constitution. Given the fact that all forces are committed with the same aim, I don't see it failing. I cannot imagine it failing, because people wanted to succeed from the Communist Party to the right, then it will work. This is the present situation with the Constitution.
And as a follow-up, what do you imagine that constitution will look like compared to the failed constitution that was just voted down?
I think it will be a much more traditional constitution in terms of the way in which it is redacted and the way in which it is presented, probably. But what is important to me is that it will keep certain essential progress that was made after the social explosion and during the constitution that was rejected. It will keep these elements: equality for women, equality for all minorities, and protection of the environment, recognition of the native populations. This is, and I'm sorry, and a fifth aspect which is increasingly important: more power to the regions, less power to Santiago. I think that these 5 things will be in the new constitution. They were in the previous one, but probably the way in which it will be presented will be very different. In all cases, it will not have 100 pages.
Or 388 articles.
Yeah.
Should we open up to the floor? Yeah. I think we're going to open it up now to the floor.
Thanks to you both for that wonderful dialogue. Please keep your seats. So now is our opportunity to ask a few questions. My colleague Meg in the red plaid is going to run the mic. Just to let you know, this is being live streamed. So if you ask a question, you'll be live streamed. So just want you to know that. But we want to answer any questions that we might have. So please raise your hand. Oh, there's one right here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for coming here. I have a question about perhaps the biggest international crisis that started in February 2022, and that's the Russian-Ukrainian war. Chile has been obviously supportive of the United States that's tried to rally the Western allies to support Ukraine. But a lot of countries in Latin America are somewhat ambivalent towards Russian aggression, sometimes partly because of past American behavior in Latin America. So my question to you is, how do you think Chile could help the United States to change the minds of many Latin Americans and Latin American governments in this really the biggest international crisis of our times, probably? Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. Chile didn't hesitate a moment to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the president mentioned this very strongly in his speech at the UN, and the United States government has recognized this position as an important position. And you're right also when you say that other countries in the region have been, and other leaders in the region in particular, have been more ambiguous vis-a-vis the problem. Your question leads me to say something about Latin America in general. The fact is that one of the problems is that the famous objective of an integration of the region is so far away now that it is extremely difficult to imagine how we would manage to associate ourselves in all sorts of things, and particularly on these topics. We want the negotiations on Venezuela in Mexico to succeed, and we understand that the Venezuelan government is really the Venezuelan government. It is Maduro, we have to talk to him. But we will not accept the situation as it is, and we will not accept that human rights are not being violated in Venezuela because they are being violated in Venezuela. This equilibrium is not the same that our brothers in Latin America have vis-a-vis the question, vis-a-vis that issue. Therefore, if for us it is difficult to change their mind vis-a-vis Venezuela, you can imagine how difficult it is to change their minds vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. It's a very complicated thing. We ought to be probably more aggressive at the UN and more aggressive in multilateral circles with our friends in order to convince them and to persuade them to vote in a determinate fashion. The entrance of Lula in the region and Brazil in the present conditions is a game changer. I mean, we don't know exactly what is going to happen, but it is important what he's going to say. Chile is a country that has always been in favor of integration, and our president has said, we want to integrate in a very practical way. We want to have a table of discussion on pandemics and the way in which we can cooperate among ourselves. We want to have another table on the environment and how can we work together in order to confront this. We want to have another table on issues like the equality of women, human rights. But when you see that today in Buenos Aires, there is the meeting is just beginning. You have in the press the idea that they will form, they will use one money for Argentina and Brazil. You say, you know, in order to do that, you have to make a long trip before having a common central bank, have an integrated economy, etc. Therefore, Latin Americans continue probably to propose themselves objectives that are very far away, and they don't look at what is really affecting them. In that sense, the effect of the Russian aggression is enormous in our economies, and I think that all countries recognize that, but I think it is a difficult task to unify Latin America in the same position as it should, because it's the Charter of the United Nations, finally, what is being violated.
Thank you. So you all set? Okay. Yes, sir, right over here, please. Thank you, Meg.
Hi, thank you again so much for taking the time to come speak with us. We really appreciate you being here. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the U.S.'s current policy vis-a-vis Venezuela, and whether you think that continuing sanctions and enforcing them upon Maduro and his regime is a sustainable way forward.
I think that there are certain sanctions that are not useful. Sanctions should not be justified by themselves. It's not that the US is punishing somebody without results. Let me mention a phrase that I heard from a very important American decision maker. Excuse me if I don't quote him personally, but he said to me one day in frustration, you know, the bombing of Tokyo during the Second World War is as absurd as a position than the blockade of and the destruction of the capacity of Venezuela to produce oil, because it was a punishment without an objective. There was no possibility of reaction, and now we have no policy. The country has been destroyed. What do we do now? And I think that this is true. I think that sanctions ought to be applied in certain circumstances, and they are important, but it is not this application of sanctions like that. One Tuesday in the morning you apply a sanction in Haiti against a guy who is a gangster, who is known as General Barbecue, and has never had an account in the United States in his life, and he doesn't care. And the information is there is a sanction against him. What kind of sanction? You see, these things ought to be assessed much more in a much more deeper way than they are sometimes assessed. The Venezuelan situation is extremely difficult because if Maduro feels that he has the support and the recognition of countries like France, and that he has in Europe, and that he has the possibility of attracting the United States because of the need for oil, there is no reason for him to talk to the opposition. Therefore, the negotiations might disappear. Therefore, the pressure on Maduro needs to be kept, and I think that the Spanish government understands that, some European countries understand that, and it is important what Lula will do in the same thing. I understand perfectly well that Colombia has to have a good relation with Venezuela. They cannot continue to be confronted to each other because they are neighbors. The level of immigration of Venezuelans into Colombia is extraordinary. But there is a need to keep on criticizing the internal situation of Venezuela, because if not, you will consolidate a situation of abuse and a situation of dictatorship that we don't want in the region.
Thank you both so much for your talk. Thank you, Professor Kulak, and thank you, Ambassador. My question is sort of, I'm struck by the fact that you began this talk talking about this long 200-year relationship.
I don't understand with
the mask?
I'm
okay,
sorry.
Fair enough.
For a second,
You're good. Cool, better? No?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm struck by this 200-year relationship, right, between our two countries, specifically as it relates to the question of democracy. And I'm struck by the fact that here in this country, as well as in Chile, there are sort of movements undergoing for sort of democratic renewal, or rather, how do we better understand what democracy means? And so the first part of my question to you is, I'd be curious to hear your sort of understanding of democracy, right? Is it merely a form of government, representative democracy, elections, et cetera, or is democracy perhaps something more that moves beyond the form of government? Is it a set of practices that we have to continually renew? And the sort of follow-up to that question would be then, how do you see that being actualized in the form of a new constitution? Right? In the Constitution that was just voted down, it seemed that there was a push for the state to be the sort of guarantor of certain rights and practices we associate with democracy. And so I'd be curious to hear sort of what your speculation is how might those practices or democratic ideas be codified constitutionally?
I think that we are all aware that there is a global risk and a global attack on representative democracy. That democracy is in danger. It is in danger in this country, it is in danger in Chile, it is in danger in Europe. We didn't have, since Mussolini, an ideology that appealed to people who were in situations of difficulty in those middle sectors of society that didn't develop and felt attacked by globalization. It is much easier to convince a Chilean who is suffering in Santiago by the increase in violence and the increase in crime that a strong man can help and support his cause than all these members of Congress that are presented on TV fighting among each other and big confusion. And this is becoming very serious. Therefore, the only possibility to face that, as you say, is to reinterpret the way in which we consider democracy, to increase democracy. In other words, to make democracy a practice that is more attractive to people. This means probably the introduction in the constitution of plebiscites that can attract people to participate. We have made vote obligatory. During some time, we thought that, some people thought, I never thought that, but some people thought that it was good to free the possibility in which people could choose if to vote or not to vote. And that happened during our governments. It was at the end of the Ricardo Lagos government and the beginning of Michelle Bachelet government, in which the constitution was changed. Now we have come back to the obligatory vote, and I think that this is important, because people have this feeling that if they have to pay taxes, they can vote. They have to vote. They have two responsibilities vis-à-vis society and the community. But it is clear that democracy, parliamentary democracy as it is now, representative democracy as it is now, is not a definite answer to the problem of democracy in the world. And in that sense, when people say we have to create big fronts of resistance to the authoritarian forces that are increasing their power in the world, it is not simply adding social democrats to radicals or to center Christians, Christian in the center. It's a discussion on the way in which we can make democracy each day better. There has to be some deliberación, we say in Spanish, around that. And I think that one thing that has happened and which is positive in Chile, even if I think that, of course, if I say this to practical people, they will say this is a loss of time. But we have discussed so much during the last 4 years. I mean, the social explosion produced such an internal discussion and a lack of security on where we were going that that has been extremely good for the country. People are accepting new ideas in a way in which they didn't accept them before. For instance, the equality of women today, the 50% limit, is accepted by the whole right. The whole conservative parties accept that. If you told them 6 years ago that they would accept in 5 years that every assembly had to be organized by 50% of women and 50% of men, they would have answered that you were crazy, that they would have never accepted that. Today, there is no discussion about that. The same happens with the importance of the environment and with the importance of the indigenous people and the indigenous population. Therefore, I think that we value democracy much more than others. I think that Lula will value more democracy today than he valued before the famous attack on the governmental buildings. But I fully agree with the idea of your question, behind your question, which is that democracy has to renew itself if it wants to survive, because it's clearly being threatened in a very serious way today.
Thank you. And this will be our final question.
Thank you for coming again, Ambassador. So my question is about this idea that you touched on at the beginning of your speech about retreating United States, but also an idea of the United States that is sometimes overbearing. I think that the U.S. struggles to strike a good balance sometimes. Like we talk about the coup in Chile when they, there's argument for U.S. involvement in the overthrowing of Allende. And then there's also an issue today of the U.S. being too soft-handed, being almost uninterested, like you said. So for a problem like you were talking about Nicaragua, how would you suggest, and I know that you're on a diplomatic mission, so you cannot speak too honestly, how would you suggest that the United States help the situation in Nicaragua without becoming too involved, maybe threatening that country's independence? Because the United States military has already been in Nicaragua. We've also been a few places.
The last thing you said, I didn't get it. The United States is? The
United States has been in Nicaragua before, the military. So how should we strike a balance between being a global United States without this tendency that sometimes we've had in the past to take control of things to a very high degree?
This is a very important question, and it is a very critical question, because it is funny that sometimes Latin Americans say, we don't want the US to have a policy towards Latin America. My father used to tell me when I was 15 years old or 16 years old, people complain because there is no American policy towards Chile. I'm so happy there is no American policy towards Chile. Then, because the fear was intervention, of course. But at the same time, I have lived a long life now, and I remember very well when we had UNASUR. UNASUR was the organization of the southern countries in the region. And I remember I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we were having a meeting in some place, I don't remember, Colombia or in Bogota, I don't remember. And suddenly there was the information that there was a coup in Paraguay. And in 10 minutes, we decided that we had to go to the airport, take a flight to Paraguay, go to Asunción, present ourselves, the Brazilians, the Argentinians, the Uruguayans, etc., and say, there is no coup here. We are going to mediate between the two factions. We could do these things. Today, we cannot. We can't, because we are divided. And the UNASUR doesn't exist anymore. At the time, we communicated to the United States in a different way because the United States appreciated what we did in that sense. Today, it's much more difficult to do that because it has to communicate with each country. What I mean to say is that we have multilateral organizations that allow us and allow the United States to focus on a topic like Nicaragua and say this is intolerable, and reunite those in Latin America who defend human rights and discuss with them. You know what happens sometimes with the United States? That you feel they don't have the time to talk to you. They don't have time. They are too busy. They feel that Ukraine is too important and therefore let us wait till next month. Which I don't discuss that Ukraine is very important, but I think that the possibilities of discussing with the United States and reflecting together on what we have to do in the region has practically disappeared sometimes. I'm very keen, very close, very, very moved by Haiti. And I discussed very often the Haitian situation with the State Department and with my friends in the American government. And I see the problems they face, and I see how people are expecting what they are going to do. What are you going to do? And it's not clear what has to be done in Haiti. But I think that this type of reflection in which a Chilean ambassador or an Argentinian ambassador or a group of ambassadors from Latin America meet with the Americans to discuss what to do together is the only way of solving a problem like Nicaragua. I'm not talking about an American invasion or an American blockade or anything like that. Last word. 70 years of blockade on Cuba, it's immoral. It's intolerable. And this has been happening without anybody paying attention to it. It's something that you cannot believe. When Boric was celebrated because he had condemned the imprisonment of Cubans protesting for the lack of freedom, he said, yes, I condemn them, but I also have to say that the blockade is a violation of human rights of Cubans. And this is true, and this is a feeling of all over Latin America. If you ask me what unites Latin America, the only thing that unites Latin America is the feeling that the Cuban situation is intolerable, and it shouldn't continue. And this was expressed in Los Angeles in front of President Biden, and we don't see the reason why it continues, frankly speaking. That the Cubans have to confront the situation of the pandemic, trying to get oxygen, and they take 2 years in order to get oxygen because they cannot pay, because their payments are not accepted by any bank in the world because of the Helms-Burton law. It's something that is intolerable. It's incredible. Therefore, I think that a common discussion among us on the way in which we should act in the hemisphere and in the region between Latin Americans and the United States is something very important. There is now something called American Partnership for Economic Progress, Inter-American Partnership for Economic Progress, or something like that. We have signed the agreement. The agreement is an invitation to Latin America from the United States to discuss the way in which we should develop, the way in which we should organize our economies, the way in which we could be more efficient. We have asked to include the environment, the way in which we could fight against earth warming in a more efficient way, and we want to discuss also the critical situations on human rights, because I think that this is as important as the question of trade or the question of investments, at least. Therefore, in one word, the answer in front of Nicaragua is the only possibility is to show Nicaragua and to show the leaders of present Nicaragua that Latin America and the United States cannot tolerate together the way in which the country is evolving. I think that there is no other solution than that.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we thank you so much for joining us today. And your wife, Antonia, thank you for joining us today, man. Appreciate you. And they have a granddaughter who is out on ground somewhere, who's a junior in high school. So we're selling her very hard at this moment. Mr. Professor, Professor Klubach, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you.